The turkey was still warm when my mother looked across the Thanksgiving table, set down her fork, and said the sentence that finally broke 8 years of silence. "You're just a burden. Always have been." My brother Garrett laughed. Not the awkward kind. Not the "this is uncomfortable" kind. A real laugh. The kind that says he agreed. My father lowered his eyes to his plate and kept chewing like nothing had happened. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, stood up, took my coat from the hook by the front door, and walked out. No slammed door. No dramatic speech. Just the soft click of the lock behind me. But here's what none of them understood in that moment. For 8 years, I had been the one paying for the roof over their heads, the mortgage, the utilities, my father's insurance, the property taxes, the groceries when things got tight. They called me a burden while sitting inside a house I was financially carrying. And what happened after that Thanksgiving dinner didn't just expose my family. It cost them everything. My name is Sloan. I'm 32, a CPA from a small town in Pennsylvania, and this is the story of how my family treated me like an ATM for 8 years, then learned what happens when the ATM finally shuts off. If you've ever been the quiet one who kept everything together while everyone else took the credit, stay with me. Because this story doesn't end at that dinner table. It ends on courthouse steps, with my family watching me take back everything they thought I'd never fight for. I should have known what my place in the family was when I was 14. That was the year I won first place in the state math competition. I remember carrying the trophy home on the school bus, holding it carefully in my lap the whole ride so it wouldn't scratch. It wasn't huge, just a gold-colored trophy with my name engraved on a little metal plate. But to me, it felt like proof that maybe, just maybe, I mattered. When I walked into the house, the kitchen smelled like pepperoni pizza. My mother, Linda, had ordered 4 large pizzas to celebrate Garrett making the JV football team. He was 17 and had finally made the roster as a backup safety. She was glowing. "Your brother works so hard," she said, smiling as she handed him the first slice. "Not everyone can make a team, you know." I set my trophy on the counter beside the pizza boxes. No one looked at it. Not my mother. Not my father. Not Garrett. Dinner that night was all about his coach, his cleats, his future, his talent, his potential. Afterward, I washed the dishes while my trophy sat untouched on the kitchen counter. It stayed there for 3 days before I finally carried it to my room myself. Garrett had the biggest bedroom in the house, his own TV, a lock on the door, space. I had the little room next to the laundry area, where the dryer rattled through the wall half the night, and my window faced the neighbor's garage. That month, I overheard my mother telling a neighbor that Garrett was going to get an athletic scholarship one day. He didn't. He got cut from the team a few months later for missing practices. But nobody ever adjusted the story. Garrett was still the golden child, still the dream, still the investment. And I learned something at 14 that most people don't learn until adulthood. Sometimes silence protects you, and sometimes it traps you. At the time, I hadn't figured out which one mine was. I went to Penn State on an academic scholarship that covered most of my tuition. I worked the rest. Morning shifts at the campus bookstore, weekend hours at a tax prep office, late night studying while eating peanut butter sandwiches because they were cheap and filling. I graduated in 4 years with an accounting degree and no debt. Garrett, meanwhile, lasted 1 semester in community college before deciding it wasn't for him. He moved back into my parents' basement to focus on his first big business idea. That business was custom-printed t-shirts. It lasted 4 months. The website technically still exists. The sales do not. 2 years after college, when I was 24 and working my first real accounting job, my mother called me crying. My father had torn ligaments in his back on a construction site. Workers' comp covered the surgery, but not everything else. The bills were piling up. They needed help. I was making $36,000 a year. Not rich. Not comfortable. Not even close. But I said yes. I started sending $800 a month. That was more than a quarter of my take-home pay. I ate ramen 5 nights a week. Skipped lunches. Bought work clothes from Goodwill and hemmed them myself at my kitchen table. When I asked whether Garrett was contributing anything, my mother's voice went cold. "Your brother is building something. You just have a job. That was the first check. I still remember sitting at my tiny kitchen table in a studio apartment with a radiator that clanked at 2 a.m., signing my name at the bottom, sealing the envelope, and walking it to the mailbox. I told myself it was temporary. Just until my father recovered. Just until they got back on their feet. Just until Garrett figured something out. But temporary turned into months. Months turned into years. And years turned into a system my family had no intention of ever changing. By year 3, I'd been promoted to senior accountant. By year 5, I'd earned my CPA license after studying at night on top of full-time work. By year 8, I was making $58,000 a year and had built a side bookkeeping business that brought in extra income. On paper, it looked like I was doing well. In reality, I was financing a life that wasn't mine. Every month, the same numbers left my account. $1,200 for the mortgage, $340 for my father's insurance supplement, $180 for utilities, and twice a year, the property taxes. Over 8 years, I sent my family roughly $186,000. I know the exact number because I tracked every dollar. I'm an accountant. Numbers are how I survive chaos. Meanwhile, Garrett cycled through failed dream after failed dream. First the t-shirt business, then cryptocurrency trading, which burned through thousands of dollars of my mother's savings. Then a food truck concept that never became more than a logo and a Pinterest board. Then real estate flipping, despite the fact that he had no money, no property, and no actual plan. His total financial contribution to the household over 8 years? 0. Not almost 0. Not very little. 0. But my mother never changed the script. Garrett was the one with potential. Garrett was the one meant for bigger things. Garrett was the one she introduced proudly at church and family events. I was just the daughter who did bookkeeping. Fine. Reliable. Useful. Forgettable. A month before that Thanksgiving, our church held a potluck. My mother volunteered me, without asking, to bring 2 homemade pies. Apple and pecan. So I made them. Of course I made them. When I walked into the fellowship hall carrying both pies, my mother was already near the coffee table with one hand resting proudly on Garrett's shoulder. "Pastor Juan, have you met my son?" she said. "He's working on something really exciting." Garrett reached into his pocket and handed over a glossy business card for a company called Garrett Juergens Enterprises. It sounded impressive. It was also fake. No office, no income, no inventory, no plan beyond a few YouTube videos about real estate investing. Someone near the dessert table asked, "And what does Sloan do?" My mother barely looked at me. "Oh, Sloan?" she said with a shrug. "She does bookkeeping. She's fine. Fine. The way you describe the weather. The way you describe a chair in the corner. The way you mention something that exists but doesn't matter enough to discuss." I stood there holding 2 pies I'd baked for people who probably wouldn't even notice if I disappeared. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something shift. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something colder than that. Clarity. On the drive home, I stopped at a Wawa, bought a coffee, and sat in my car for 40 minutes staring through the windshield. I wasn't crying. I was recalculating. Because every accountant eventually has to ask the same question when the numbers stop making sense. How long do you keep funding a liability that will never become an asset? And for the first time, I let myself ask it about my family. Thanksgiving morning started at 5 a.m. I was in my apartment kitchen with a 20-pound turkey I'd brined overnight in a plastic bucket because my fridge was too small to hold it properly. I made everything from scratch. Mashed potatoes with real butter. Green bean casserole with fresh mushrooms. Cranberry sauce from whole berries, because my mother once said canned sauce looked cheap. Stuffing. Gravy. Rolls. Sweet potatoes. By 11, my whole apartment smelled like a restaurant. I packed everything into containers, loaded my Honda, and drove 25 minutes to my parents' house with the heat, turned up so the food wouldn't go cold. The house was quiet when I got there. My father was in his recliner with a heating pad on his back, watching football on mute. My mother was upstairs getting dressed. Garrett was still asleep in the basement. I let myself in with the same key I'd had since college and started working. I set the table, wiped down the counters, adjusted the thermostat, checked the oven twice, laid out the cloth napkins, the nice ones I had bought my mother 3 Thanksgivings earlier. Nobody thanked me. Nobody asked if I needed help. Nobody even acknowledged that I had cooked an entire holiday meal and brought it into a house I was already paying to keep standing. At 2 o'clock, Garrett finally came upstairs in a hoodie and sweatpants, hair messy from sleep, and dropped into a chair. "When's dinner?" My mother appeared behind him immediately and put a hand on his shoulder. "Garrett, honey, sit down. You must be exhausted." Exhausted. He had been asleep until 90 seconds earlier. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a serving spoon, looking at him in the chair I just wiped down, and thinking how surreal it was that I was somehow both invisible and responsible for everything at the same time. That's the thing about being the reliable one in a dysfunctional family. They don't praise you for carrying the weight. They just hand you more of it until your back bends so naturally no one remembers you were ever standing straight. Dinner started the way every holiday dinner in that house started. My mother talking, Garrett performing humility, my father staying quiet, and me making sure everyone had what they needed before I sat down last. My mother lifted her glass of boxed wine. "I just want to say how thankful I am for my Garrett," she said, smiling at him. "Always making this family proud." Garrett lowered his head in that fake modest way he'd perfected years ago. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "I've actually been looking at a few lots outside Route 9. Real estate is where the smart money is." He said this while sitting in a house I paid for, eating food I cooked, under lights I covered the bill for. Then my mother turned to me. "And you, Sloan, what do you have to be thankful for?" I opened my mouth, and before I could answer, she said it. "You're just a burden. Always have been." She said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather, like she was pointing out that the potatoes needed more salt, like it was a fact so obvious it barely deserved emphasis. Garrett laughed. "At least I make this family proud." My father stopped chewing and stared at his plate. That was it. Not the first insult. Not the first humiliation. Not even the worst thing they'd ever done. But it was the first time all the math added up at once. 8 years of checks. 8 years of sacrifice. 8 years of swallowing every slight and every dismissal and every lie I told myself about why I stayed. And in one sentence, my mother balanced the books for me. I looked down at the napkin in my lap, the one I had folded into a little fan 2 hours earlier. Then I set my fork down, folded the napkin once, placed it beside the plate, pushed back my chair, stood up, walked to the front door, took my coat from the hook, and left. "Where are you going?" My mother called after me, sounding annoyed more than concerned. "Dinner isn't over." I didn't answer. Because for me, it was. The drive home was silent. No music, no tears, no phone calls. Just the road, the heater, and the kind of stillness that only comes when something inside you has finally snapped clean in two. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't cry. I took off my coat, set down my keys, sat on my couch, and opened my banking app. I had 3 automatic payments scheduled every month. $1,200 for the mortgage, $340 for my father's insurance, $180 for utilities. 3 payments, 3 taps, cancel, confirm, confirm, confirm. It took less than a minute to end 8 years of financial support. I stared at the screen for a few seconds after the last payment disappeared. Then I set my phone down on the coffee table and leaned back. For the first time in nearly a decade, the money in my account was going to stay there. For the first time in nearly a decade, I wasn't going to subsidize people who treated me like a burden while depending on me to survive. For the first time in my adult life, I chose myself. And 12 days later, my father called. "Sloan," he said carefully, The mortgage payment didn't go through. The bank sent a letter. I closed my eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Ask your pride and joy. Silence. I could hear the television in the background. Some game show. Some meaningless noise filling the house I'd been financing. Sloan, you can't just I can, I said. And I am. Then I hung up. And I had no idea that cutting them off was only the beginning. Because a few weeks later, I opened my credit report and found a second mortgage, attached to my name, on a house I didn't own, for $47,000. A mortgage I had never signed. A loan I had never approved. A fraud tied directly to the same house where my family had just called me a burden. And that's when this stopped being a story about family betrayal and became a story about bank fraud, identity theft, and the most expensive mistake my brother ever made.